Even though he was home alone, he rushed to the bunker, and she said that's what saved him. And children here have had to really think about these things.
Questions have been asked about why it's taken time for the UK COVID public inquiry to get underway. Sweden's, for example, was concluded last year.
President Zelensky is the centre of attention here, and that sends a pretty blunt message to Moscow.
More than just the headlines. The BBC News Channel. Watch on iPlayer.
Hello, I'm Christian Fraser, and this is The Context.
The next few days, especially today, tomorrow and Thursday, will be difficult days.
When we first arrived here, most of the smoke was coming from over there, but in the last few minutes, there's been a flare-up just down here. And of course, the strong wind is not only making things tougher for the people fighting the fires, but much more dangerous.
So if we don't stop burning fossil fuels very, very soon, then these kind of heat waves will become even more frequent.
Good evening, welcome to the programme. I tell you what, the satellite pictures from Greece tonight show the enormous extent of the wildfires currently sweeping across the country. The Prime Minister is telling the Greek people today that his country is at war with climate change. We'll focus tonight on the report which suggests the extent of the current heat wave in Europe, in China and the United States would be virtually impossible without human-induced climate change. Crisis of a different kind tonight in Israel, where the reservists are threatening a boycott and the unions are withdrawing their labour. What else is this hard-right Israeli government considering? And the unseen parts of a CV that might just win you an interview. We'll talk about the new hack that has been developed to circumvent the AI filter. But let us begin with those wildfires in Greece. Reports tonight that 2 Air Force pilots who were helping to fight the fires died when their plane crashed on the island of Evia. Greece's government says emergency teams are battling fires now on multiple fronts. They continue to wreak havoc on the Greek islands and on parts of the mainland. Greece's largest island, Crete, was the latest to be put on high alert. On roads, more evacuation flights have taken off and at least 10% of the land on that island has now been burned. From there, our correspondent Jenny Hill reports.
Unrelenting, unforgiving, the fires are raging on. Firefighters battling to contain them, not just here on roads, but on the islands of Evia and Corfu too. It's desperate, dangerous work. This afternoon on Evia, a terrible reminder of the risks taken. A firefighting aircraft dumps its water, appears to clip a tree and loses control. We've chosen not to show the moment of impact. So many are putting themselves in harm's way. Like volunteer firefighter Panagiotis, who takes us to see what this fire can do. His team's camping nearby, still on high alert. Their village is just down the road.
You can understand our anguish. We were running to put out the fire. We were desperate to save the forest, but we were also desperate to save our houses and our families.
When we came to the top of a nearby hill, the scale of the challenge became obvious. Up here, you really get a sense of how difficult the task is for firefighters. When we first arrived here, most of the smoke was coming from over there, but in the last few minutes, there's been a flare-up just down here. And of course, the strong wind is not only making things tougher for the people fighting the fires, but much more dangerous. This isn't the image this tourist island wants to project. Earlier, the Greek Prime Minister acknowledged that difficult days lie ahead. Which is why, even here, a birthday's worth celebrating, though the candle's unlit.
You don't like the
No, we don't like the fire.
We only put out the fires, he jokes. We don't start them. Jenny Hill, BBC News, Rhodes.
Yeah, pretty relentless job for those firefighters. As I told you, the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis told Parliament today that the climate crisis is already here. It will manifest itself everywhere in the Mediterranean with greater disasters. He likened the wildfires raging in Greece to a war. Let's speak to Dr. Theodore Yanaros. He is a fire meteorologist at the National Observatory of Athens. Dr. Theodore, good to have you with us on the programme. When you look across the map tonight, what do you see? Do you see a fire service that's getting control of the fires, and are the conditions helping or are they hindering that effort?
Well, fire weather conditions remain still very dangerous to support the spread of wildfires. As far as I know, the situation looks better compared to the previous days. However, we still expect another day tomorrow to be very difficult, extremely difficult, because we will have very hot conditions, very hot weather, dry conditions, and also we have some westerly, southwesterly winds that could help fires, if ignited, spread. So we need to remain focused tomorrow and then wait for fire weather to improve the days after.
Can you talk specifically about the islands, Crete and Rhodes? We understand that it's particularly dire in those places, and obviously there will be holidaymakers coming in to the country. There will be holidaymakers in the country who want to know what the situation is and what the advice is.
Well, I can talk only about the conditions that are related to the likelihood of getting wildfires. As I told you, we expect another difficult day tomorrow because we have this combination of hot, dry and windy weather, both in Crete and Rhodes Island. And we expect some improvement of fire weather conditions from Thursday and onwards as the temperature will drop by about 9 to 10 degrees Celsius. So it would be less easier for any fire to ignite and spread fast like the ones we had in the past few days.
You'll have read the report, which we're going to discuss shortly, that was published today by a group of international scientists, which say that this event would be virtually impossible without human-induced climate change. Does it feel to you, year on year, that the situation is getting much worse?
Yeah, I fully agree. This is what the scientific community has been warning us since the past few decades, 2 or 3 decades. What may be surprising is that we're experiencing all these unpleasant consequences of man-made climate change a bit earlier and with more intensity than we may have been expecting to experience in them. This is very surprising, but we have been expecting them, that's for sure.
If you're in a war, as the Prime Minister suggests this is, how do you better prepare for battle? What sort of decisions does the country have to make when this firefighting season is over?
Well, I think it was 2 years ago that the World Meteorological Organization stressed out the importance of for the governments to really invest in early warning systems, because it is the early warning systems that improve readiness and also response. And these systems can be used to protect lives, properties, and also the environment. So this is what we currently have to do in the middle of this climate crisis, as well as continue investing in mitigating climate change by reducing greenhouse gases emissions.
Dr. Theodore Llaneras, thank you very much for being with us. The heat wave stretching across parts of North America and Europe this month would have been virtually impossible without human-induced climate change. That conclusion from this group of international scientists was come to by comparing current events with historical data and climate models. Those comparisons suggest that heat waves like those experienced in July can now be expected to occur once every 15 years in North America, once every 10 years in Europe, and once every 5 years in China. Let's get some analysis then from the climate scientist Professor Richard Allen, who is at Reading University. Professor Allen, good to have you on the programme. We were told not to look at specific climate events in isolation, but this report is quite specific, it seems, that what we're witnessing right now is as a direct result of climate change, correct?
Well, that's right. So weather patterns generate extremes like heat waves, but it's obvious from all the evidence that we've collected over many, many years that climate change due to human emissions of greenhouse gases are intensifying these events. And that's precisely what this study has demonstrated very clearly using tried and trusted methods.
Those tried and trusted methods, can you talk about the modelling? How do you come to a conclusion like this?
Yeah, so it's not just modelling. There are multiple lines of evidence that are used. There are observations, there's physical understanding of the meteorology that's going on, there's knowledge of the impacts that it produces. But you're right, a key aspect of this is using very complex computer simulations. And the way these are used, they run experiments, realistic ones for the present day, and they run lots more experiments where the warming from greenhouse gas emission caused warming is basically removed. And so by doing those two sets of experiments many, many times, you can build up the statistics and really show how the fact that these heat waves in the southwest USA, North Mexico region, and also southern Europe would have been virtually impossible had this warming not occurred.
We've got a debate that's building in this country about the government possibly rolling back some of the green commitments it has made, and also the opposition rolling back some of their commitments too. And we've seen it across Europe. Do you think reports like this become the sort of evidence that governments can present to people saying, look, these are uncomfortable, sometimes costly decisions, but this scientific evidence we've compiled shows why it is absolutely necessary? Is that the purpose of some of these reports?
Well, that's quite right. You learn a lot from doing these types of analysis as well, in terms of the meteorology, in terms of how we can be better prepared for these events, in terms of planning, but also forecasting. But as you say, it underlines completely all the evidence that we've built up, for example, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and various other organisations, and huge numbers of studies by many, many scientists across the world. It's obvious that the main thing you can do to limit the severity of these events is by cutting rapidly and drastically greenhouse gas emissions such that we get to net zero. So any residual emissions are balanced by uptake by the oceans and the land. And it's only when we get to there that we'll limit the warming and we'll stop these severe events getting worse. And of course, it's not only heat waves. We've seen wildfires associated with heat waves, also droughts, but perhaps next week we'll be talking about intense flooding, because that will also get worse as the climate warms. Like we've seen terrible events in South Korea, but also places like Niger in Africa, even in other parts of the USA recently, in Indonesia.
But there's an important qualifier to what you're saying. Yes, we of course have to cut the amount of CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere, but even if we stopped it dead right now, we wouldn't reverse or roll back what is now forecast in this report. Is that right?
Well, that's right, but we'd limit the warming, so we would stop these events getting even worse. So we're already seeing impossible events happen. We're going to see even more impossible events happen more frequently, but even more severe. So unless we limit the warming, these things are only going to get worse.
But what I'm suggesting is that if they are going to happen every 15 years, every 10 years, every 5 years, and there's nothing we can do to stop it, then we are going to have to put in place the mitigating factors, managing forests, the way we use water, how we provide things in cities for people to cool down. All those decisions will have to be made irrespective of what we do on CO2.
Well, you're right. We do have to adapt to the changing climate, but if we don't cut greenhouse gases rapidly, we're going to go well beyond what we're seeing now, well beyond. So it's obvious that we need to cut greenhouse gases. That's the number one priority. Inevitably, we're going to have to adapt to worsening climate and, in the longer term, rising sea levels as well.
Professor Allen, grateful for your time this evening. Thank you. A Brussels court has convicted 6 men of murder and attempted murder for their part in the 2016 Islamist bombings in the Belgian capital, Brussels, that killed 32 people and injured more than 300. The attacks were the deadliest in Belgium since the Second World War. Let's talk to Paul Kirby, the Europe editor of the BBC News website. What more do we know then about these verdicts, Paul?
Well, they came in after many days of deliberations, and frankly, everybody was waiting all day for them. What in the end we heard was there were 10 people on trial, and 6 people, as you say, 6 men have been convicted of terrorist murder and attempted murder and terrorist association belonging to a terrorist group. Now, chief among these 6 are Salah Abdeslam and Mohammed Abrini. Salah Abdeslam was the only survivor of the Paris attacks in November, just 4 months before the Brussels bombings. He fled to Brussels immediately after the Paris attacks. So he's been found guilty of that. He actually denied any involvement at all in the Brussels bombings because he was arrested just a few days earlier. But he's been found guilty, as has Mohammed Abrini. He actually confessed to this attack because he was eventually caught. He was known as the man in the hat because he was involved in the Brussels bombing of the airport. Now, there were 2 bombings. First of all at the airport, and then an hour later at Maalbeek metro station, very close to all the EU institutions in Brussels. But Abrini had fled the airport because apparently his bomb didn't go off. He was eventually arrested along with other suspects 2 or 3 weeks later. They are 2 of the 6 people who've been convicted. They'll be sentenced later.
Yeah, it was quite an extraordinary investigation. I spent quite a lot of time in Molenbeek, and it did go far and wide. At the culmination of that investigation today, Paul Kirby, thank you very much. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching BBC News. Let's take a quick look at some of the headlines making news here in the UK. The number of people living in temporary accommodation in England is at its highest level since records began 25 years ago. At the end of March, nearly 105,000 families were classed as homeless and needing local authority help. That number includes more than 130,000 children. The government says it has given £2 billion over 3 years to help councils tackle the issue. The boss of NatWest has admitted she was the source of an inaccurate BBC story about Nigel Farage. Dame Alison Rose called it a serious error of judgment. The BBC has apologised for reporting that Mr Farage's account at Coutts Bank, which is owned by NatWest, had been closed for purely commercial reasons. The bank's board says it has full confidence in Dame Alison. The Just Stop Oil protests have cost the Metropolitan Police more than £7.7 million since April. The Met said policing 515 arrests carried out by the group amounted to the equivalent of 23,000 officer shifts. You're watching BBC News. Israel is in deep uncertainty. Last night, the Knesset passed a bill which strips the judiciary of a power to overrule the government if it has acted unreasonably. It's not a power that is often used, but it was employed in January when the court ruled the appointment of a minister was unreasonable in the extreme because of his previous criminal convictions. The government was forced to remove him. Last night, thousands came out onto the streets in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, blocking highways and clashing with security forces. The government is now facing a revolt by reservists who are refusing to serve, although it's not yet clear how many reservists are involved or whether they would maintain that boycott during a major crisis. With me in the studio, critical voice on the reforms is Hen Matzik. He is a senior fellow with the Tel Aviv Institute. Welcome. Thank you for being with us. Let's just step back, because before the election, Benjamin Netanyahu engineered a coalition, a bloc of what were essentially far-right fringe parties, ultra-religious nationalists. Are they now dictating the agenda of this government?
It certainly seems like it. The conversations that we're seeing that are coming from within the government, within the coalition, it just seems like Netanyahu is no longer in control. And as we know, it's the most far right-wing government that Israel has ever had. And even during the voting yesterday, you could see the Minister of Defense arguing with another minister and Benjamin Netanyahu in the middle without being able to even break it apart or make a call on what the future is going to be, and I think that's even more concerning.
The US government says it's unfortunate, the bill that's been passed, and obviously there are deep questions now about democracy in Israel, but the government would say, look, this was always part of our agenda, people voted on it, and that is democracy.
Yeah, democracy means a liberal democracy, rather. What Israel is a place where people vote and the government make decisions, and then there should be checks and balances to make sure that the liberal democracy nature of the country maintains. And at this point in time, if the government will continue with this legislation that what the Minister of National Security called the appetizer, and they will have more and more legislation to strip down any authority from the judicial system, it would make any decision that they want to pass just not have any criticism or any ability to stop them. If there would be anything that is, we don't have a constitution, but if there would be anything that would harm minorities, that's what the Supreme Court in Israel has been doing for so long, since the beginning. It was protecting minorities, and at this point we're seeing that the government is trying to strip them of these rights, and it's really concerning for many Israelis.
So implications here, not just for democracy in Israel, but for the Palestinians and for wider peace in the Middle East.
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing the people that are pushing it from within the government, and just this morning the ultra-Orthodox Party has tried to suggest a basic law into the Israeli basic laws that is saying that studying Torah should be equated to military service, which is compulsory in Israel, which means that they want to be exempt from military service. It's just one example of where we're heading as a country. And Israel is a booming economy; it's a startup nation, and to see that the economy is going down. I mean, what they're doing to Israel, Liz Truss has resigned for far less than what's happening to the Israeli economy today.
You talked about military service. We must talk about the reservists. We don't know how many reservists are signing up to this boycott, but I mean, would they withdraw service in the event of a crisis, in the event of a crisis on the northern border or within Gaza? How far would they take that?
I'm a reservist myself, and I know that even though I oppose the judicial overhaul, I would still come to reserve when I'll be called. I think that's something that Israelis are doing. I think that they are very concerned, rightfully so. I mean, we're speaking about 400 pilots that said that they're not going to show up, and I think they're just voicing their deep fear of the future. I do think that they would show up. I don't think that Israel would be left without an army, but it's a clear red sign for the Israeli government to stop and to rethink how we're moving forward. And it's a call for, I've been in the studio so many times defending Israel against international scrutiny, and today I'm here to tell Israel and to tell Jews and Israelis around the world that we have to stand up for our country, because the future will be grim if we won't stop this.
Just a brief word on the protest movement. They packed up last night after the vote in the early hours of the morning. Where is that protest movement now? Does it peter out because the bill has gone through, or does it sustain?
I think it sustains, and I think that according to the polls, you've seen that a majority of Israelis are against continuing with this legislation, and they have done what they have set to achieve. I think the protest must continue, and we must speak up, and we must stop this legislation, and it's for the future of Israel, of our country that we love, is on stake.
Hen Matzik, Senior Fellow with the Tel Aviv Institute. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Now, we're going to talk about TikTok, because it's expanding its empire and it's moving into e-commerce to sell Chinese-made goods in the United States. The Wall Street Journal reported today that the platform intends to develop to compete with other online shopping platforms like Shein and Temu. Beginning in August, according to unnamed sources, the social media platform will offer an Amazon-like marketplace. It's called the TikTok Shopping Center, which will allow users to go to one place to view and buy their goods. TikTok like Amazon, will act as the conduit for retailers based in China, handling all the marketing and the logistics. The Journal reports that Chinese suppliers will only be paid by TikTok after US customers are secured and a purchase has been made. The plan is to increase the total net worth of transactions on TikTok from $5 billion last year to $20 billion this year. Well, joining me to discuss is the technology and digital marketing expert Dan Sodergren. Dan, thank you for coming on the programme. Is TikTok well suited to this sort of venture?
Well, TikTok's got something like 1.5 billion users. It's been downloaded 3 billion times. In fact, a few years ago, it knocked Google off the top spot of the kind of the thing that was most searched for the most. And if you're a 16 to 24-year-old, it's most probably one of the most important social media applications in your life. In fact, you could argue some of the most important things. In fact, some shocking statistics actually about how long people spend on there. The average user of that age group spends more than an hour a day on there and goes back onto the app 15 times. So if you can imagine someone doing that every day, but also they can buy things, yeah, they are very, very well suited to do this. I mean, whether they can compete with Amazon, but we've got to remember, of course, it's about a generational thing. At the end of the day, my daughter is 12, and so she might not even know what Amazon is. Of course she does, and she buys, and I buy things from there for her. But those other names you mentioned, which she also might be buying from, yeah, TikTok is the avenue into a whole new generation.
Using Amazon, you're showing your age. The elephant in the room here, though, of course, is that governments are taking TikTok off computers and office mainframes. So, what sort of reaction is there going to be from legislators to this? Because what you're talking about here is expanded use.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been old enough to talk about, as they called it, S-commerce, social media commerce, for a very long time. And before then it was mobile. And now all these things have come together. And this is a hugely powerful juggernaut for the future, not only the future of commerce, but potentially future of work and all sorts of things. And what we've got to remember, this is a massive data play as well. It's not just what you're buying. It's your geolocation. It's potentially an awful lot more things about things that you like. Imagine if you're melding together lots of different apps that we use now into one powerful app that has all that data. I would imagine the legislators and other people, certainly in the West, would be very scared about this. Whether those fears are xenophobic or otherwise, or political, is completely different. The reality is, though, if TikTok wanted to make a play into artificial intelligence, then this would be a very, very clever way to do it and get all the data to start building their own machines and almost predicting the future of the next generation of what they're going to buy.
Extraordinary, especially after the announcement from Elon Musk about the way he's developing X. Dan Sodergren, thank you very much indeed for that. Plenty more on that on the BBC website. Do stay with us. We're going to talk plenty more about the climate and also ways that people are developing their CVs to beat the AI filters. I'll tell you all about that. Do stay with us.
Never miss a story. Get the headlines as they happen. And watch BBC News live wherever you are. Download the BBC News app.
Hello, I'm Christian Fraser. You're watching The Context on BBC News. The children on the front line of Yemen's forgotten war after 8 years of conflict. We have a special report.
I feel scared and run. There's a lot of explosions.
Tell you all about that forgotten war very shortly, but first we're going to get a check on the sport at the BBC Sports Centre for us this evening. Tolson. Hello, Tolson.
Good evening, Christian. There was a famous victory for the Philippines over co-host New Zealand in his second round of matches in Group A at the Women's World Cup. A headed goal from Serena Bolden in Wellington gave the debutantes their first win in the tournament. New Zealand, who themselves got a shock victory over Norway in their opening game, now need to get a result in their final match to get through to the knockout stages. New Zealand's final match will be against Switzerland, who played out a goalless draw with Norway in Waikato. The Norwegians suffered a huge blow just before kickoff when star player Ada Hegerberg picked up an injury and withdrew. The Swiss topped the group with 4 points, while Norway are bottom with just 1 and are now fighting to stay in the World Cup. In Sydney, Colombia got their tournament off to the perfect start with a 2-0 win over South Korea. Catalina Uzme got the first on the penalty spot. The second from a goalkeeping error was scored by 18-year-old Linda Caicedo. South Korea did make history when Casey Fair came off the bench. At just 16 years and 26 days, she's the youngest player to feature at a World Cup, men's or women's. Nottingham Forest have signed Sweden forward Anthony Elanga from Manchester United on a 5-year deal. The 21-year-old has been at United since he was 12 and made 55 appearances for the Red Devils, having made his first team debut in 2021. He becomes Forest's second signing of the summer. Across town, Manchester City have definitely not parted ways with Kyle Walker, despite interest in the England international defender. City, who won the treble last season, culminating in the Champions League triumph, faced German champions Bayern Munich in Tokyo on Wednesday. The club keen to secure his services, but manager Pep Guardiola insists the 33-year-old right-back won't be leaving if he gets his way.
An incredibly important player for us. Having specific qualities that is so difficult to find in the worldwide. We should be in his quality, specific qualities, obviously replaceable. So we want him yes or yes, but at the end I don't know what's going to happen. I know they are in touch, both clubs, and we will fight for him. Like I'm pretty sure Bayer will do it, but I don't know where it's going to finish.
Staying with football news, Dutch side AZ Alkmaar have been fined just under $90 million for the behaviour of their fans during the Europa Conference League semi-final second leg. West Ham family members came under attack as the match ended, prompting players to intervene. Alkmaar have also been ordered to play their next UEFA match behind closed doors, although that has been suspended for 2 years. West Ham won the game 1-0 and went on to win the competition after victory over Fiorentina. Bronny James, the 18-year-old son of NBA legend LeBron James, is in a stable condition after suffering a cardiac arrest. A family statement says he collapsed on court while training with his University of Southern California teammates on Monday in Los Angeles. Earlier this year, he agreed to play for college team USC Trojans after becoming one of the top prospects in US high school basketball. He'd been tipped by many to be a top 10 pick in next year's NBA draft. Dutch sprinter Lorena Wiebes has won stage 3 of the Tour de France Femme, and Lottie Kopecky in the yellow jersey made a bib for stage victory in the bunch sprint, but Wiebes powered her way across the line for her second win on this year's race. Kopecky finished third. She keeps the yellow jersey and now leads by 55 seconds. Christian, more of course on the BBC Sport website. I'll be back a little bit later, but that's all your sport for now.
Tolson, thank you for that. The long-running conflict in Yemen has been forgotten amid the new crises in Sudan and the ever-worsening situation in Ukraine. But it is a war that grinds on, without end, and with children stuck in the firing line. The UN says at least 11,300 children have been killed or maimed since the conflict began 9 years ago. The rebel Houthi army, backed by Iran, seized control of the capital Sana'a, forcing out the government. Saudi Arabia backed the internationally recognised government, supported by a coalition that includes the UK and the United States. By the start of last year, an estimated 370,000 people had died as a result of the fighting and the effects of malnutrition. The UN estimates at least 4.5 million people have been displaced, and 24 million people, that's around 80% of the population, are in need of humanitarian aid and protection. Our senior international correspondent, Orla Goen, has sent this special report from the city of Taiz.
Yemen's young know nothing but war. 8 years on, the guns are quieter, but a generation bears the scars. And if there's one place that shows their suffering, it's Al Rashid Street, a frontline neighbourhood in the city of Taiz. It's home to Badr al-Harbi, who's 7. He and his brother Hashim were hit by Houthi shelling last October, coming home from school. Since the attack, the boys' world has shrunk. They no longer go to classes. Their physical wounds may have healed, but their trauma remains, like the danger. Conflict echoes around them. Do you hear a lot of sounds from the war, Hashim? Bullets, explosions, airstrikes, shells, he says. Hashim, is it very scary when you hear the explosions and the gunfire? I feel scared and run. There's a lot of explosions. Badr wants to be a doctor when he's older. He wants to help people. First, the brothers need to return to school. I want to go back, he tells me. But my leg has been cut off. How can I go out of the house? And right next door, another little life upended. Amir was maimed on the same day last October in a second round of shelling. It killed his cousin and his uncle in their own home. Amir's father, Sharif Al-Amri, shares his pain. He says his sleeping son, who's just 3, needs another operation and has deep wounds of memory.
He remembers every moment, from the shelling to the hospital. He says, this happened to my uncle. This happened to my cousin. He talks about the smoke and the blood. It's always on his mind.
Munir is another worried father of 4. He can't afford to move his family out of harm's way. All of this shelling is from the Houthis, he says. And we're in the firing line of their snipers. We have cover here from the buildings, but there are snipers nearby. We've been told they're in a crescent around the area, and local people say they normally get busy at around sunset. Tell me about the situation in here, Munir. His front room is in their sights. He knows exactly where to sit. I'll show you the sniper's place, he says. It's far, don't worry. Look, over there. Then Munir tells us if we go out into the garden, we'll be shot. Back on the street, Sharif tries to distract Amir. Don't be scared, my love. You're a man. But he's just a child who has seen too much. He asks Amir what he wants in the future. Buy me a gun, he says. I will put a bullet in my gun and fire at those who took my leg. It will go right to them. Most of the children maimed and killed in Taiz over the years have been victims of the Houthis, but some died in airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition. If peace comes, and many Yemenis have their doubts, the young will carry this war forever. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Taiz.
Well, let's go live to Sana'a. We can speak to Radia Al-Mutawakkil. She's the chairperson of Muatana Organisation for Human Rights. Thank you for being with us. Your organisation documents hundreds of incidents in which people have been killed, maimed, civilian infrastructure that's been destroyed or damaged. Who are you producing that evidence for? And does it make any difference to the international decision making?
Well, we were doing this since the beginning of the war because we thought it will matter and it will make difference if we succeed to raise the voices of the victims to the international community. Actually, when we started to do our advocacy campaigns outside Yemen, I was surprised that documentation telling the truth documented with a very high standards of international standards, it's not enough, because officials internationally, regionally, and locally, they do know what's happening in Yemen, and they do know that there are a lot of violations by all parties to the conflict against civilians and civilian objects. So it does make difference, but not the amount that's supposed to be, because the war is still going on. It's 8th year. The violations are still going on. Parties to the conflict, they deal as they have impunity, and they are not afraid of any kind of accounting.
No, I'm sure they're not on the ground. 80% of the country requiring humanitarian aid. The EU would boast that it's the biggest donor to the aid budget, and yet it's also the biggest supplier of arms and support to the Saudi-led coalition. That is enormous hypocrisy, isn't it?
Well, hypocrisy is all around the world in Yemen, and humanitarian aid is a lifeline for civilians in Yemen, but you can't feed a nation, because this is most of the population needs the assistance in Yemen. At the same time, yes, many European countries like France, the UK, and also the US, they are selling weapons to some parties to the conflict, especially Saudis and Emiratis. And because of the financial and the political interest, the war in Yemen is still going on. This is one of the reasons. And it's not only still going on. Until now, we don't have an international mechanism for investigation. And this is one of the very minimum things that civilians should have in Yemen. It's there in Syria, it's there in Myanmar, it's there in Ukraine. But when it comes to Yemen, we pushed very hard to have a criminally focused investigative mechanism. But for very political reasons, we never got one.
I know you travel to take word of what is happening in Yemen to the rest of the world, and you speak very eloquently about what is happening there. But do you think you get a fair hearing? Because there are other crises now in Sudan, in Afghanistan, the war in Ukraine. Do you think amid all that, world leaders really do have the will and the wherewithal to bring peace to Yemen?
They are aware, but they don't have the will. So it's we have traveled all around the war. Yes, I thought at the beginning that the war in Yemen is forgotten, but within the time I started to understand that the war in Yemen is ignored. It is muted in purpose for many political and financial interests and reasons. So yes, and the new crisis that's happening all over the world is just an added reason for the international community to ignore Yemen more and more, with the regional actors and also the local actors in the ground. They are all happy to be behind the scene committing violations and continue this war with not being pressure, with not having any pressure towards accountability or towards peace.
Yeah, the numbers that relate to child casualties are truly horrifying. The violations are being carried out by all parties involved in the conflict. What space is there for organisations like yours to look after children in Yemen?
We documented, as you said at the beginning, thousands of violations, and children were attacked in most of these violations, like landmines, shelling, airstrikes, child recruitment, sexual harassment, and millions of children had to leave school. And there is a new generation that they know only the Yemen in the atmosphere of war. They didn't know the Yemen even before 2014. And beside all the very direct violations, that parties to the conflict are using starvation as a weapon of war. And a lot of Yemenis are not receiving their salaries for many years, since 2016. So children are facing the most, and I don't know, even if the war has stopped now, there should be a very long, work and serious work in order to help, especially children, to overcome what's happening now, and to put them in the track of education again, because more and more Yemenis started to go to the
That's a shame. I think we almost just finished with Radia Al-Mutawakil, but the line just died there at the end. Thank you to her. Thank you for all the work that she and her organisation do. It's an important story, and plenty more on Orla's report on the BBC website. Do take a look at that. You're watching BBC News. Do stay with us.
BBC News, bringing you different stories from across the
People
UK.
on the streets of Manchester are being balloted on life's biggest questions.
Liam or Noel?
What's your preference?
Noel.
To pick sides in the hottest cultural debates.
Barbie or Oppenheimer? Barbie.
And there are those age-old questions that people in the north have pondered since the dawn of time, like barm or muffin.
Ballot bins are a fun way to dispose of your litter. So you get an option of picking a side and to drop your litter in and see which one wins.
The council are working in partnership with an environmental charity called Hubbub and the fast food chain KFC. Hubbub have installed similar ones for cigarette butts, which they say has reduced litter by 46% in cities around the world. So which subjects might be debated next at the ballot bin? City or United? Tea or dinner? My personal favourite, steam or diesel? Or best regional news programme?
For more stories from across the UK, head to the BBC News website.
State media in China say the foreign minister, Qin Gang, has been removed from his post. He's not been seen in public for a month. Chinese officials had previously blamed health problems for his disappearance, but speculation on social media is that he'd recently begun an affair with a television presenter. And today, an official statement named China's top diplomat, Wang Yi, as his replacement. Let's speak to Robert Daly. He is the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. Thank you, Robert, for being with us. No explanation, disappears from view, and a replacement put in without much explanation either. So is that regular in Chinese politics? Is that what happens?
It is not unprecedented. The Chinese government operates in secret. No explanation has been given as to why the foreign minister is out, and you can expect no explanation to be given. He will probably simply go back home to Tianjin and not be seen again in public, although we don't know. There have been cases of some disgraced officials reappearing. But this kind of secrecy is absolutely par for the course.
It wouldn't be against the law to have an affair, would it? But maybe breaches party discipline. Does it point to divisions within the top echelons of the Communist Party?
It may well point to that. You know, having an affair is really not the way that upright Communist Party officials are supposed to behave, and especially under Xi Jinping, who's been all about anti-corruption and moral rectitude, it's very embarrassing to have it suggested that somebody that he has brought along far more quickly than the system itself would have brought him along, Qin Gang, has engaged in behavior of this kind. And yes, that suggests that it may be that enemies of Qin Gang's within the foreign ministry or within the government were waiting or saw a weakness, and that they made it known. Again, because he was advanced by Xi Jinping personally, and he leapt over a lot of the usual processes and a lot of people who'd been standing in line, we can assume that he was not universally popular.
Right, so even though he was close to Xi Jinping, and he'd only been in the job, about 6 months, the boss wouldn't be able to protect him from senior people who maybe follow other leaders within the party?
Well, this is speculative, and I wouldn't take it too far. I don't think that this points necessarily to deep factionalism within the party. It could merely point to deep dislike for Qin Gang himself. So there's been much made of this, especially in the American media, which is enjoying Xi Jinping's embarrassment and China's awkwardness. People are speculating that there is deep factionalism in the party. We really don't see a sign of that. Xi Jinping, who has had a very bad run for the past few years, still seems to be firmly in command.
Does foreign policy change? Are there any nuances to policy depending on who occupies this job, or does it just continue irrespective?
So China's Minister of Foreign Affairs is actually not the leading foreign affairs officer of the Chinese government. Qin Gang reported previously to Wang Yi, who has now been named as both foreign minister and also as the counselor who oversees foreign affairs. But everybody in the foreign affairs bureaucracy reports directly to Xi Jinping. They don't improvise much. So when Qin Gang, who was seen as something as a wolf warrior who reveled in attacks on the West, and the United States in particular, when he engaged in that kind of behavior, this was understood to be with the approval of Xi Jinping himself. So I don't think that we're going to see a major change in China's diplomacy, either in its goals or in its style, just because Qin Gang is out. It won't matter that much.
Robert, thank you very much indeed for that one to watch. Wang Yi, a known commodity, has done the job before. Now, have you ever applied for a job you thought you might have a chance of getting, only to find you didn't even get to the interview stage? Increasingly, it is AI that is doing the sifting, but there are some clever people out there who have hacked the system. It's called white fonting. The concept is pretty simple. The candidate will copy a long list of keywords relevant to that job description into their resume, but then change the font colour to white, invisible to the human eye. The AI bot picks up the white text and surfaces that resume to the top for human review. Jason Walker is co-founder and managing director of Thrive HR Consulting. Did I explain that right? I spent a lot of time on that, Q, because I didn't fully understand it, but I imagine that it's something, it looks to AI something like a word cloud. Would that be right?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Christian. That's exactly what it does. You obfuscate the wording in the resume by making it white, by making the font white. And so the human eye doesn't see it, but the AI does pick up on it, and it will key in on the keywords to essentially try to push your resume up to the top of the stack. But yeah, you did it well.
So if you were employing this hack, you would, like the picture we're seeing on screen at the moment, you would just throw in 1,000 words, perhaps, that are buzzwords that employer would be looking for.
Yeah, it's really trying to, game the system. So you throw in, like you said, a bunch of buzzwords, and then you hope that the AI will pick up on it and see that you have the relevant skills to get the job, and it will push you forward. Part of the problem that's happening right now is there's so many people applying for jobs because of the amount of layoffs that have happened. You probably have quadruple the amount of people that are applying for jobs. So people are really desperate to get their resume seen.
Yeah, I understand that. And I understand how you would have to do a first sift of those applications. But there is a broader question here about how effective AI is at finding the right candidate. I mean, there might be people who don't get the right buzzword and don't employ this particular hack, but face to face, they might be the ideal candidate.
Well, I think one of the problems with employing this tactic is if you do it and you do get noticed, you still have to go through an interview process to determine that you actually know these skills and you have competencies in these skills. So just because you get your resume noticed and you get this hack to work, it doesn't necessarily mean that it bodes well for you when you go through the interview process, because if people start to detect that you did this, I think it really questions your credibility coming into an organization when you essentially try to cheat the system to get a job interview.
Just a quick one. I've only got a minute left, Jason, but presumably AI is being used in other ways to get jobs, for cover letters, maybe to improve photos that are put on applications.
Oh, AI is basically ubiquitous with job search right now. There are headshots that you can do by uploading 20 different pictures of yourself, and it will customize headshots. You can have AI upload your resume and do mass applications for as many jobs that you want. There's AI that will help you do interviewing through the system and ask you interview questions based upon the type of job and the skill sets that you need to interview. So AI is just breaking in very, very quickly into the candidate interviewing process.
Jason Walker, thank you very much for your time. I'm not sure AI would be able to help me with my image, but maybe it could put in the buzzwords. Maybe I could get through that initial process. It is being used to greater and greater extent. It is the future. We'll be right back. We're going to take a short break.
This programme asks plain questions with the help of the unrivalled range of BBC journalists right across the world and gathered here in this building. I'll also draw on my time reporting on global conflict and meeting countless heads of government. Frontline experience that helps me know who to talk to and who to listen to, meaning our analysis is objective, unbiased, and I promise you with absolutely no spin. That's why we call our programme Unspun World.
Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Hello, I'm Christian Fraser, and this is The Context.
The next few days, especially today, tomorrow and Thursday, will be difficult days.
When we first arrived here, most of the smoke was coming from over there, but in the last few minutes, there's been a flare-up just down here. And of course, the strong wind is not only making things tougher for the people fighting the fires, but much more dangerous.
So if we don't stop burning fossil fuels very, very soon, then these kind of heat waves will become even more frequent.
Welcome back. Tragedy tonight in Greece. 2 Air Force pilots killed battling wildfires on the island of Evia. We'll bring you all the latest on the evacuations from Rhodes and Crete. Also tonight, NatWest apologises to the British politician Nigel Farage for revealing private information about his account. And the glossary on corporate gobbledygook. How familiar are you with the language employed within your workplace? We're going to return, though, before all that, to the wildfires in Greece. Reports tonight that 2 Air Force pilots who were helping to fight the fires died when their plane crashed on the island of Evia. Greece's government says emergency teams are battling fires on multiple fronts now. They continue to wreak havoc on the Greek islands in particular, but also on the mainland. Greece's largest island, Crete, was the latest to be put on high alert today. And also on Rhodes, more evacuation flights have taken off. At least 10% of the land on that island has been burnt. From there, our correspondent Jenny Hill.
Unrelenting, unforgiving, the fires are raging on. Firefighters battling to contain them, not just here on Rhodes, but on the islands of Evia and Corfu too. It's desperate, dangerous work. This afternoon on Evia, a terrible reminder of the risks taken. A firefighting aircraft dumps its water, appears to clip a tree, and loses control. We've chosen not to show the moment of impact. So many are putting themselves in harm's way. Like volunteer firefighter Panagiotis, who takes us to see what this fire can do. His team's camping nearby, still on high alert. Their village is just down the road.
You can understand our anguish. We were running to put out the fire, we were desperate to save the forest, but we were also desperate to save our houses and our families.
When we came to the top of a nearby hill, the scale of the challenge became obvious. Up here you really get a sense of how difficult the task is for firefighters. When we first arrived here, most of the smoke was coming from over there, but in the last few minutes there's been a flare-up just down here. And of course the strong wind is not only making things tougher for the people fighting the fires, but much more dangerous. This isn't the image this tourist island wants to project. Earlier, the Greek Prime Minister acknowledged that difficult days lie ahead. Which is why, even here, a birthday's worth celebrating, though the candle's unlit.
You don't like the
No, we don't like the fire.
We only put out the fires, he jokes. We don't start them. Jenny Hill, BBC News, Rhodes.
Well, yesterday, Greece's Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis told Parliament the climate crisis is already here. It will manifest itself everywhere in the Mediterranean with greater disasters. He compared the wildfires that are raging in Greece to a war. Dr. Theodore Genaros is a fire meteorologist at the National Observatory of Athens, and earlier he gave us this update.
Fire weather conditions remain still very dangerous to support the spread of wildfires. As far as I know, the situation looks better compared to the previous days. However, we still expect another day tomorrow to be very difficult, extremely difficult, because we will have very hot conditions, very hot weather, dry conditions, and also we have some westerly, southwesterly winds that could help fires, if ignited, spread. So we need to remain focused tomorrow and then wait for fire weather to improve the days after.
Can you talk specifically about the islands, Crete and Rhodes? We understand that it's particularly dire in those places, and obviously there will be holidaymakers coming in to the country. There will be holidaymakers in the country who want to know what the situation is and what the advice is.
Well, I can talk only about the conditions that are related to the likelihood of getting wildfires. As I told you, we expect another difficult day tomorrow because we have this combination of hot, dry and windy weather, both in Crete and Rhodes Island. And we expect some improvement of fire weather conditions from Thursday and onwards as the temperature will drop by about 9 to 10 degrees Celsius. So it would be less easier for any fire to ignite and spread fast like the ones we had in the past few days.
You'll have read the report, which we're going to discuss shortly, that was published today by a group of international scientists, which say that this event would be virtually impossible without human-induced climate change. Does it feel to you, year on year, that the situation is getting much worse?
Yeah, I fully agree. This is what the scientific community has been warning us since the past few decades, 2 or 3 decades. What may be surprising is that we're experiencing all these unpleasant consequences of man-made climate change a bit earlier and with more intensity than we may have been expecting to experience them. This is rather surprising, but we have been expecting them, that's for sure.
If you're in a war, as the Prime Minister suggests this is, how do you better prepare for battle? What sort of decisions does the country have to make when this firefighting season is over?
Well, I think it was 2 years ago that the World Meteorological Organization stressed out the importance of for the governments to really invest in early warning systems, because it is the early warning systems that improve readiness and also response. And these systems can be used to protect lives, properties, and also the environment. So this is what we currently have to do in the middle of this climate crisis, as well as continue investing in mitigating climate change by reducing greenhouse gases emissions.
Well, the first 2 weeks of July were probably the Earth's hottest on human record, and scientists said today that these long extreme periods of heat that we're witnessing in southern Europe and in the United States would be virtually impossible without the influence of human-caused climate change. They'll become ever more common. In fact, if the composition of the Earth's atmosphere were to remain at today's levels, which it won't, the United States can expect prolonged heat waves like the one it is sweltering under now, at least every 15 years. In southern Europe, 1 in 10 chance. In China, where last week they broke the national temperature record, 126 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 52 degrees Celsius, there's a 1 in 5 chance of a recurrence. Here's Dr. Frederica Otto from the Grantham Institute for Climate Change.
We have seen and known for years that heat waves are getting hotter and more intense and longer because of human-induced climate change. So if we don't stop burning fossil fuels very, very soon, then these kind of heat waves will become even more frequent. So we are likely to see a heat wave like this every other year in a 2-degree world.
If it is a war, or at least a constant, ever-worsening battle against heat and extreme weather, then we will need to adapt. In some parts of the world, that process has already begun. In the western United States, the Colorado River is the lifeblood for about 40 million people, stretching 1,400 miles from the Rocky Mountains in the north to the Sonoran Desert in Mexico. But the enormous extraction of water, mainly for farming, coupled with the climate crisis, has increased the evaporation. The snowpack that feeds the river is reduced, and that has brought the US West to crisis point. Just recently, they renegotiated the extraction rights, revising agreements that were signed all the way back in the 1940s. Live to Sharon Megdal, Director at the University of Arizona Water Resources Research Center. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. I'm intrigued. Does the experience of weather as acute as this lead to changes in thinking? Was it easier to get a deal on sharing water because the heat dome last year had concentrated minds?
Well, thank you for having me on. You know, there are so many factors at play and things are changing all the time that it's hard to attribute to one weather event any particular happenings. But in the United States, in the Colorado River Basin, was that last spring, the river flows were so low, the water in storage was so low that alarm bells were sounded more loudly than ever. And there was an indication from our federal government that water deliveries must be cut. And it was a very, very difficult process of negotiation. But then in the middle of the process of negotiation, we had a very, very good winter. And so what emerged was some voluntary cutbacks that will get us through the next few years while we go into even harder negotiations as to what to do in the longer term about the lower Colorado River flows. So we got a little reprieve because we had a very good winter of snow, and the runoff is quite good right now.
What is really interesting about this example, though, and they were 13% cuts, am I right? 13% cuts in what the main states were taking from the water, Arizona, Nevada, and California. That's a significant.
That's right.
That's a significant amount of water. Does that force policy change in terms of how water is utilised, whether it is for drinking water, potable water, whether it's used for agriculture? Does it force policy change of the kind that we're going to see in other parts of the world?
Well, I think it does lead to policy changes, but exactly what they'll be may vary by each state. It may vary for the United States versus Mexico. Colorado River is shared by 7 states or 30 indigenous and country of Mexico. Over 70% of the water is used by agriculture, but we have a very complex system of water rights and allocations. And so to date, these cuts that you mentioned are a combination of mandatory cuts that the states agreed to with the federal government, Mexico agreed to with the US, and then some voluntary cuts where people are getting compensated for leaving water in the river and not taking as much. But the real question of really structural changes to the allocations from what they were established 100 years ago and since then remains to be seen. So our region has a lot of work to be done, but I think what is encouraging about it and what the model may be for other regions is that we have mechanisms in place. We have a very inclusive process now of consultation, and there's an established and respectful relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. Tribal nations are getting more involved. And so what's so important to working through these issues are having mechanisms in place for consultation, for deliberation, because we don't want to end up in the courts, because that takes time, that takes money, and that doesn't produce water. And so it's really imperative that people figure out what to do to address the situation and adapt.
But you'll have seen the modelling today that suggests heat waves like this will become much more common. Maybe every 10, 15 years in the United States we'll see heat domes of the kind that people are sweltering under at the moment. And you've already said that the negotiations heading into the future are going to get that much more difficult. What would 2 degrees, which is where we're headed, mean for the Colorado River and the sharing of water rights into the future?
Well, 2 degrees, and the heating that's already occurred, the increase in temperature that's already occurred, has led to changes in precipitation patterns. It's led to changes in runoff. It's led to earlier melting of runoff, evaporation. So more heating will lead to further changes in precipitation patterns, more demand as temperatures rise, and changing flows. And we can't act like we have a river producing maybe 50% more runoff annually than is actually being produced. And so it's a new reality that we must adapt to. And it isn't going to be easy. It isn't going to be overnight. And I think even currently, some people are saying, well, this is just cyclical. So there are still some people who don't necessarily believe that these are permanent aridification manifestation and the like. But we have to deal with the lower flows, and people are looking at different methods of irrigation. We're looking at producing or trying to produce more food with less water for a growing population. This is truly a global challenge.
Sharon, just a final one before I let you go. There's a debate globally about who shares the cost for this. And of course, the United States is a big party to that. But what about internally within the United States? Because these 3 states that we just talked about are pretty much the breadbasket, particularly California, for the rest of the United States. So if water is a diminishing resource, what do the states in the West say to the rest of the country about who picks up the tab for this?
Well, that's a great question, because we have a very established system of water rights. And so if you can't just take water away from those who hold the rights to use water. And so a lot of what's being discussed is how to do things through voluntary arrangements, through incentivizing. And the question of who pays is very, very important. Right now, we did have some major federal investment going into incentives and efficiency programs. We have the state of Arizona, where I live, has instituted a new program of incentivizing agricultural efficiency. And so we're all going to see some burden of this, but exactly who pays is going to depend on what we do. For example, if food production is cut, prices at the supermarket go up, and that means everybody pays. And so these are real burdens, and how the burdens will be spread and established is not yet clear, but we have a lot to figure out and a lot to work on. And the good news is that we have a lot of people really working on it, understanding that we have to address this problem because this is too big a problem for us to fail with, and we have to take action. Exactly what those actions will be, I think we'll see over time.
It's a fascinating insight into the future. Sharon Megdal, thank you very much for coming on the programme. A debate that will be had nation by nation and even within countries, state by state. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Let's take a quick look at some of the stories making news here in the UK today. The number of people living in temporary accommodation in England is at its highest level since records began 25 years ago. At the end of March, nearly 105,000 families were classed as homeless and needing local authority help. That number includes more than 130,000 children. The government says it has given £2 billion over 3 years to help councils tackle the issue. A man has been found guilty of sexually assaulting and murdering his 16-year-old sister. Amber Gibson's body was found in woodland in Hamilton in South Lanarkshire in November 2021. The judge told Connor Gibson that he faces a lengthy sentence for what he called the depraved attack. Gibson will be sentenced in September. The Just Stop Oil protests have cost the Metropolitan Police more than £7 million since April. The Met said policing 515 protests carried out by the group amounted to the equivalent of 23,000 officer shifts. As well as marching in main roads, activists disrupted some major events. You are watching BBC News. A Brussels court has today convicted 6 men of murder and attempted murder for their part in the 2016 Islamist bombings in the Belgian capital that killed 32 people and injured more than 300. The attacks were the deadliest in Belgium since the Second World War. Paul Kirby, the Europe editor of the BBC News website, gave us more details about the verdicts.
They came in after many days of deliberations, and frankly everybody was waiting all day for them. What in the end we heard was there were 10 people on trial, and 6 people, as you say, 6 men have been convicted of terrorist murder and attempted murder and terrorist association belonging to a terrorist group. Now, chief among these 6 are Salah Abdeslam and Mohammed Abrini. Salah Abdeslam was the only survivor of the Paris attacks in November, just 4 months before the Brussels bombings. He fled to Brussels immediately after the Paris attacks. So he's been found guilty of that. He actually denied any involvement at all in the Brussels bombings because he was arrested just a few days earlier. But he's been found guilty, as has Mohammed Abrini. He actually confessed to this attack because he was eventually caught. He was known as the man in the hat because he was involved in the Brussels bombing of the airport. Now, there were 2 bombings. First of all at the airport, and then an hour later at Maalbeek metro station, very close to all the EU institutions in Brussels. But Abrini had fled the airport because apparently his bomb didn't go off. He was eventually arrested along with other suspects 2 or 3 weeks later. They are 2 of the 6 people who have been convicted. They'll be sentenced later.
The boss of NatWest, which owns Coutts, has admitted a serious error of judgment in discussing Nigel Farage's relationship with the bank. Dame Alison Rose said she was wrong to respond to questions from the BBC's Simon Jack, our business editor, about that private account, and wrong to suggest the decision was made in relation to his wealth and financial situation. The ex-UKIP leader had secured information from Coutts that revealed it was his political views that were taken into account. Yesterday, the BBC and Simon Jack apologised to Mr Farage. NatWest said it had full confidence in Dame Alison at the helm. The government has said in a democracy, a person's political views should never be a reason to cancel someone's account. Let's get more with Anna Isaac. She's the Guardian City editor. Nice to see you, Anna. In the football world, if you get the full confidence of the board, you're usually out by Christmas. So what do you think Dame Alison's future is at NatWest?
I think if you need to issue a statement this close to releasing results, remember their results are coming out on Friday, those are very sensitive results, then you are making it very clear that her fate has been hanging in the balance today. That's how statements of confidence work. They have to be required. So it means that it was a live question whether or not she was going to stay in her job. So I do think it's fair to say that there are still question marks potentially hanging over that, and that it's going to be a very bumpy time for the bank in the lead up to Friday. It's also clear from the statement and the letter issued to the BBC, remembering we've got different accounts of how this all came about in terms of the reporting of this story, not only just the situation of Nigel Farage's relationship with Coutts, the wealthy banking arm of the NatWest group, to look at here. And I think it's going to be hard to reconcile all of the different accounts that we've been offered in the coming days. Certainly people will be picking over it, and that's a very challenging backdrop for the bank when it has its results coming out first thing Friday morning. So I don't think it begins and ends with the statement of confidence we've seen today, for sure.
Well, it seems to me, Alison, that there are 2 professions where you don't discuss people's personal affairs. That's in medicine, your doctor, and your banker. But it's particularly true of the private banking world. That is why people go to banks like Coutts. They enrol or they take out an account because they want a certain amount of privacy. And her maintaining her position at the bank can't be good for Coutts either, can it?
Well, the Financial Conduct Authority and UK banks in general are very clear that actually the requirements for confidentiality and privacy that apply to anyone that uses their bank are just that. They're for all customers and clients of a bank. So yes, there are certain aspects of, you'll see a lot of private banks will emphasize their discretion in their advertising materials, as you say. But the fundamental principle that privacy should apply to your use of banking actually covers the whole sector. And it's not just on the basis of wealth. So there's in the same way that there might be restrictions on whether or not you meet the threshold for a wealthy bank like Coutts. That doesn't apply. You can be a very ordinary person with a very humble amount of money in your bank account, but your relationship with your bank and how you spend and use your money with them is meant to be of the utmost privacy. The FCA, the watchdog that covers the city's financial regulation, is very clear on that.
Simon Jack has apologised, but of course he was fed the information which was wrong. So ultimately she shares the blame. Did she do it, do we know, unwittingly? Or was she trying to put him off the scent? Did she have real knowledge of why the account was closed? Do we know that? And is there any investigation into that?
That is incredibly tricky to establish. So both the statements made by the BBC in their letter of apology to Nigel Farage, that is obviously more extensive than Simon Jack's tweets, and the statement issued by Alison Rose this afternoon offer a bit of a disagreement in terms of what may have happened. So Dame Alison's statement is very tightly worded, and it makes a note that she did not reveal any personal information about Mr. Farage. And she says that it was only in response to a general question about eligibility criteria that she explained the thresholds that Coutts required. But that doesn't quite line up with the story that the BBC then ran, where it supposedly subsequently not only heard from her, but then checked with her, where it says that Nigel Farage fell below the threshold. So the suggestion is either that Simon Jack inferred that, or that Alison Rose gave him the information. But when it comes to the principle of confidentiality, if someone's inferring something from your statements and you fail to correct them, you are revealing information.
Yeah.
You can then sort of revise that and say, I didn't say quite that specifically, but it's very clear that you're revealing something. That's why it's a new story.
We'll have to go to a break. Anna Isaac, thank you very much.
You experienced racism. Why didn't you walk away?
That's a really good question.
You're a politician.
I'm not a politician. I don't read the polls.
Yeah, you
I
are
sit
a
in Judiciary Committee. No,
you are very definitely a politician.
No.
The very fact that there were not people who looked like you.
Hold on. I'm only halfway through my answer.
Is secret schooling happening across Afghanistan for girls?
It does.
You simply can't assume that.
Actually, yes, you can.
Hard Talk. Watch on BBC iPlayer.
Hello, I'm Christian Fraser. You're watching The Context on BBC News. 8 men are convicted of murder and attempted murder for their part in the 2016 Brussels terror attacks. Welcome back to the programme. Here in the UK, the Prime Minister has been told it would be political suicide to lurch away from the green pledges the Conservative government has made while in office. There are concerns for both major parties that if they dilute their plans to combat the climate crisis, with evidence mounting that costly green solutions are unpopular at the ballot box, they might undermine their position internationally. We've seen it in Spain this week, we've seen it in France with the Yellow Vest protests, and we saw it last week in the Uxbridge by-election. The Tories narrowly won the seat by just 495 votes on a campaign against the London Mayor's plan to extend the ultra-low emission zone. So, what is going on and how will it affect these negotiations? With us to discuss is Nadine Batchelor-Hunt. She's political reporter at Politics Home and broadcaster. Thank you for coming on the programme. It's interesting just watching the debate here over the last week since the Uxbridge by-election that it's not just the Conservatives. I mean, obviously the Prime Minister's getting a lot of heat from the right of his party, but it's not just the Conservatives that are now thinking about what they put out there in the public domain with regards to green policy.
No, of course. And, there has been a bit of a row in Labour about this policy because, the Uxbridge and South Ruislip by-election was an election that Labour really hoped to win. It's been a seat they've targeted for quite a while. And obviously it was quite high profile because it was Boris Johnson's now former seat. So to lose that by-election came as a bit of a shock. And to lose it by, I think it was 495 votes. Labour were kind of, going back to the drawing board quite angry. And I think Sadiq Khan, who stuck quite strongly by this ULEZ zone policy, obviously he's the Labour London mayor, got a lot of stick and has since kind of indicated that he'd review this policy. But it has thrown a kind of an issue into the ring where there's a divide between, potentially between Labour and the Conservatives that the Conservatives feel they can exploit, particularly at a time when, they're so far behind in the polls. They're looking at this now and thinking, is this a wedge issue we can use in our battle to try and hold on to power at the next election?
Quote here from Michael Gove today, the Levelling Up Secretary of State. Yes and yes when asked about the government's commitment to end petrol and diesel car sales in the UK by 2030. So there are some policies they're not going to roll back on, but clearly there are decisions to be made in respect of the cost of living, and that is what was at the root of Labour's defeat in Uxbridge.
Absolutely, and I think there was a sense that there was a bit of tone deafness in how hard London Mayor Sadiq Khan went at this policy. It's £12.50 a day to drive your car in a ULEZ zone. If you can't afford to replace your car and it's not ULEZ compliant, then that's extra cost on driving to work every day, taking your kids to school every day. And there were London Labour MPs that were also greatly concerned about this, particularly when some of these areas are quite poor. So it did feel quite tone deaf, I think, to a lot of people, in Uxbridge and in the Labour Party. And I think this is why it's become a bit of a row. But unfortunately, it seems that this has kind of grown now beyond ULEZ, beyond the Uxbridge and South Ruislip by-election, and more broadly onto green policies. And the government are kind of viewing that and thinking, we held on to Uxbridge and South Ruislip because of unhappiness with some of these policies that people felt were moving too quickly or in too tone-deaf a way. Perhaps this is an area, not just on ULEZ, but more broadly on things like, insulation on homes for landlords, producing rules around that, where they have to have a certain level of efficiency by 2028. Are these areas where we can roll back on slightly, roll back on some of our pledges towards net zero to try and bring in those votes that they know they're hemorrhaging for the next election?
Yeah, one of our panellists called it greenlash last week, which is not a bad term for it. And as I say, we have seen it in the recent Spanish election with parties on the right who want to roll back some of these commitments, making some ground. A lot of the political argument, Nadine, on the left in America and here has been that green is good for the economy, good for jobs, good for export and the environment. So why are politicians losing that argument? Or maybe that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Maybe it doesn't lead to jobs and to cost savings.
I think it's because moving towards net zero has lots of potential. And I think, what Biden's doing in America, particularly with the Inflation Reduction Act, I think it has a big focus on green energy and has been quite successful. Is, going green, moving towards net zero does require those sacrifices on day-to-day things like the cars we drive or even the food we eat or the way in which we insulate our homes. So there are those trade-offs where, it's not always going to be easy to save the planet, to put it bluntly. And I think those, when it becomes a bit more difficult, when it's less slogany and doesn't have the kind of added benefit of economic growth attached to it, it's those policies that I think politicians are struggling to, approach in a real practical way. And arguably, it's about preparing people for these changes as well. I think one of the arguments around the ULEZ zone in London was people weren't given enough time to prepare for this big change, and particularly on the backdrop of, as you've mentioned, the cost of living crisis. So I think it's about getting the tone and the time right, but also there is inevitability with these things that they're not going to be easy. There are going to be things we have to give up that we don't want to give up in order to, stop more of what we're seeing in Europe right now with this heat wave.
Yeah, absolutely so. It's a really interesting debate. Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, thank you for coming on the programme. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Well, Israel is in a deeply uncertain place tonight Last night, the Knesset passed a bill which strips the judiciary of a power to overrule the government if, in its view, it has acted unreasonably. It's not a power that is often used, but it was employed in January when the court ruled that the appointment of a certain minister was unreasonable in the extreme because of his previous criminal convictions. The government was, in the end, forced to remove him. Last night, thousands came out onto the streets in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, blocking highways, clashing with security forces, and the government is now facing open revolt by reservists who are refusing to serve, although it's not entirely clear how many reservists are involved or whether they would maintain that boycott during a major crisis. Hen Matzig is Senior Fellow with the Tel Aviv Institute and a critical voice on those reforms.
The conversations that we're seeing that are coming from within the government, within the coalition, it just seems like Netanyahu is no longer in control. And as we know, it's the most far right-wing government that Israel has ever had. And even during the voting yesterday, you could see the Minister of Defense arguing with another minister and Benjamin Netanyahu in the middle without being able to even break it apart or make a call on what's the future is going to be, and I think that's even more concerning.
The US government says it's unfortunate, the bill that's been passed, and obviously there are deep questions now about democracy in Israel, but the government would say, look, this was always part of our agenda, people voted on it, and that is democracy.
Yeah, democracy means a liberal democracy, rather. What Israel is a place where people vote and the government make decisions, and then there should be checks and balances to make sure that the liberal democracy nature of the country maintains. And at this point in time, if the government will continue with this legislation that what the Minister of National Security called the appetizer, and they will have more and more legislation to strip down any authority from the judicial system, it would make any decision that they want to pass just not have any criticism or any ability to stop them. If there would be anything that is, we don't have a constitution, but if there would be anything that would harm minorities, that's what the Supreme Court in Israel has been doing for so long, since the beginning. It was protecting minorities, and at this point we're seeing that the government is trying to strip them of these rights, and it's really concerning for many Israelis.
So implications here, not just for democracy in Israel, but for the Palestinians and for wider peace in the Middle East.
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing the people that are pushing it from within the government, and just this morning the ultra-Orthodox Party has tried to suggest a basic law into the Israeli basic laws that is saying that studying Torah should be equated to military service, which is compulsory in Israel, which means that they want to be exempt from military service. It's just one example of where we're heading as a country. And Israel is a booming economy; it's a startup nation, and to see that the economy is going down. I mean, what they're doing to Israel, Liz Truss has resigned for far less than what's happening to the Israeli economy today.
You talked about military service. We must talk about the reservists. We don't know how many reservists are signing up to this boycott, but I mean, would they withdraw service in the event of a crisis, in the event of a crisis on the northern border or within Gaza? How far would they take that?
I'm a reservist myself, and I know that even though I oppose the judicial overhaul, I would still come to reserve when I'll be called. I think that's something that Israelis are doing. I think that they are very concerned, rightfully so. I mean, we're speaking about 400 pilots that said that they're not going to show up, and I think they're just voicing their deep fear of the future. I do think that they would show up. I don't think that Israel would be left without an army, but it's a clear red sign for the Israeli government to stop and to rethink how we're moving forward. And it's a call for, I've been in the studio so many times defending Israel against international scrutiny, and today I'm here to tell Israel and to tell Jews and Israelis around the world that we have to stand up for our country, because the future will be grim if we won't stop this.
Just a brief word on the protest movement. They packed up last night after the vote in the early hours of the morning. Where is that protest movement now? Does it peter out because the bill has gone through, or does it sustain?
I think it sustains, and I think that according to the polls, you've seen that a majority of Israelis are against continuing with this legislation, and they have done what they have set to achieve. I think the protest must continue, and we must speak up, and we must stop this legislation, and it's for the future of Israel, of our country that we love, is on stake.
Hen Matzig joining me a little earlier from the Tel Aviv Institute. You're watching BBC News.
BBC News, bringing you different stories from across the
People
UK.
on the streets of Manchester are being balloted on life's biggest questions.
Liam or Noel? What's your preference? Noel.
To pick sides in the hottest cultural debates.
Barbie or Oppenheimer? Barbie.
And there are those age-old questions that people in the north have pondered since the dawn of time, like barn or muffin.
Ballot bins are a fun way to dispose of your litter. So you get an option of picking a side and to drop your litter in and see which one wins.
The council are working in partnership with an environmental charity called Hubbub and the fast food chain KFC. Hubbub have installed similar ones for cigarette butts, which they say has reduced litter by 46% in cities around the world. So which subjects might be debated next at the ballot bin? City or United? Tea or dinner? My personal favourite, steam or diesel? Or best regional news programme?
For more stories from across the UK, head to the BBC News website.
Now, are you one of the millions of people worldwide bamboozled by corporate gobbledygook? That jargon that's used in the workplace, which you're expected to know. Maybe you've spent weeks trying to fathom what a particular acronym means, nervous that if you ask, you will be humiliated. Pivoting, downsizing, boil the ocean, bleeding edge, human resources information systems. You might think you understand those terms broadly, but could you really explain them to a new colleague? What they really mean? Well, there's a company in LA, Haystack, that is about to launch a tool, a glossary, which will demystify the office lingo we all speak, but don't really understand. Let's hear from John Carey. He's Professor of Media Management at Fordham University. Hello, John. Nice to see you. I suppose language is specific to whichever industry you work in.
Well, it's specific not just to the industry. It's specific to the department you're in. It's specific to a culture you're in. It's specific to an age you're in. Jargon is everywhere, and there's a need to help people get past it.
Yeah, I remember when I started here at the BBC many generations ago, and people started coming up to me and using some of this lexicon, and they would say, "Could you do me a donut?" Which was a sort of you would talk and then you'd play in a clip and then you'd talk a bit more. That was a donut. And then there was a two-way, which was you and the panelists talking, and then there were oofs, out of vision shots, assaids. You were the early morning BJ, the broadcast journalist. I mean, some of it sounds positively rude, but and you spent months and months trying to work all this out. If only there'd been a dictionary like they're going to create there in LA, it would save enormous amounts of man hours, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would. The thing is, someone's going to have to create the specific jargon. In other words, you can create a glossary that has FOMO and GOAT and all these more general terms, or advert, but within a specific department, within a specific company, someone's going to have to do that work, okay? And that has to be assigned, and then it has to be promoted. Because things like this, you know, you might look at it once and then go away. So you have to be like on top of it. But assuming it's created and it's publicized in the right way, it could be a really good tool for the average company and the average worker.
Yeah, language is so dangerous. I just said man hours. I do mean, of course, man hours and woman hours. It's just one of those things we sometimes regurgitate. But anyway, let's talk about whether there is more of it, because we rely on email and messaging so much in the way we communicate now. So does that lead to more of these acronyms that might leave employees lost?
It does lead to more acronyms and jargon. The other problem is it's a bit more difficult to break through in an email. It's harder in an email to say, well, in that last message, can you explain what this word meant? It's a little bit easier if it's in a regular conversation. You can stop the person in mid-sentence and say, and what does that mean? So it creates more of it, and it's tougher to break through.
Let me put some of these terms that I looked up, which are in regular use. These are in the top 50. Maybe you could explain what they mean. There's some of them that actually leave my teeth on edge, and it's this one particularly: core competencies. What does that even mean?
Well, at the end of the day, it doesn't mean anything. but it sounds like it means something good. A core competency, not just a general competency or competency. Somehow there is a competency that is at the center of things. But in general use, it really doesn't mean anything. It becomes kind of a popular term for a while, and then it goes away.
Boil the ocean. What does that mean?
Oil the ocean. Well, that's a new one for me. You also have to remember there are a lot of age-related issues here. It could be that most 20-somethings would know that. As you see, I'm not 20-something. So that term, I don't know. But I could come up with a dozen terms that a younger person would not know because it comes from, I'll give you one. I'm from Missouri. That's what Harry Truman, the president, used to say, meaning I'm skeptical. And for decades, the people who grew up in that world, like me, that's what we said. I doubt that someone 20-something now would have any idea what that means.
No, indeed so. And what about that last one there on the screen? Break down the silos.
Well, once again, the word silo is actually fairly old. It's probably 20 or 30 years old. And it meant that everyone was in certain groups in like a silo, and we need to break those down. But that expression is very old. I'd say that's 25 years old. And that's another thing that happens with jargon and why it's tough to stay up with it. It's constantly changing. I haven't heard break down silos in 10 years. Some may use it, but I haven't heard it.
Yeah, I suppose it also changes with whichever manager comes in. We used to call it Bert speak when I started at the BBC after the former Director General who brought all this language into the BBC. But it's changed again, of course, as it does as the management culture changes as well. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Really interesting. Professor John Carey there from Fordham University. Let's quickly touch on the Women's World Cup before we finish. It's about to get underway in Australia. Morning there, of course. It's just before 7 a.m. The group stages continue today with Japan taking on Costa Rica. Katie Silver is in Sydney. I'm at the end of the day. I can't even say Costa Rica properly, but it's the beginning of your day. So what are you expecting? What's to come?
Right, well, we're going to see the most divided group having their second matches of the game. So as you say, Japan taking on Costa Rica. We saw Japan last week in his first game, beating Zambia 5-0. So Japan expected to be the victor against Costa Rica, and that's because Costa Rica lost against Spain 3-0, and Spain is then playing Zambia as well. So this is the most divided of the groups, Spain and Japan. So far, both with 3 points on the table and both with some of the strongest scores on the table as well. Spain, to give you an idea, in its last match against Costa Rica, actually had 46 attempts at goal. We saw Daniela Sorella, the Costa Rican goalkeeper, managing to stave off 43 of these. She was seen as one of the unsung heroes of that match. So we may well see some strong play as well from her once again. We've also got Ireland, my apologies. Ireland, of course, lost to Australia in its opening match last Thursday, 1-0. Canada, on the other hand, has drawn with Nigeria, so we may expect there's a slight victory expected for Canada, although it's going to be a very close match. That's a very tight group.
I was just looking at some of the viewing figures, because we're always interested in that the game is growing and reaching more people. I mean, when you looked at the United States first game and the numbers watching it back at home, it is reaching across generations, and it really is finding an audience, isn't it, Katie?
That's right. And to give you an idea about that American game, we actually met loads of Americans who had travelled here in order to support them. There was 20,000 Americans, for example, that went to New Zealand alone. No doubt also hoping to do some Lord of the Rings tourism. But it is well and truly garnering more and more support, more following. We've been speaking to executives of the A-Leagues here, for example, which is the English Premier League, about just the growth that they're seeing. Without a doubt, though, it does seem that there's growth further to be gained as well from this World Cup for the women's game.
Katie, lovely to see you. Enjoy the football today. We will be back, of course, same time tomorrow. Some of you asking about the panel. We had a bit of a panel malfunction today, and all the poorer for it, but they'll be back tomorrow. We'll look forward to that. I know that there's some good people coming on the programme, so hope you'll join me for that. See you tomorrow.
Hello from the BBC Sports Centre, I'm Tolson Tollett. We'll start with football, and the Philippines picked up a first ever Women's World Cup win with victory over New Zealand on Tuesday. The tournament co-hosts could have secured a path to the last 16, but Group A will now be decided in the final round of matches on Sunday. That's after Norway and Switzerland played out a goalless draw in their second match. Nick Parrott wraps up the action.